Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. All right, so as a reminder, thank you for joining Coalition's monthly security webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about the state of ransomware. Now, ransomware is a topic that we talk about often, and it's because, unfortunately, it is targeting policyholders and businesses across the US en masse, and it's become the greatest sort of cyber threat and criminal innovation really of the last many years. And we're going to be talking about a couple different topics relating to ransomware. First, some of the trends and observations that we've had in handling ransomware incidents for our policyholders. And we're also going to be talking about the ransomware advisory that was issued earlier this month by OFAC, and what that means not only for our policyholders, but also for how we as Coalition are supporting and advocating on the forensics and the claims side. My name is Jen McPhillips. I'm going to be moderating today's discussion, and I'm excited to be joined by two of my colleagues. So first, Rich Gatz, he's a claims lead for Coalition, and he's also a gifted privacy attorney. And as part of the claims team, he partners with our customers during a claim. So from the moment that an incident is reported all the way through after the bills are paid and we've finished the remediation. And he's really our policyholders advocate throughout the entire claims process. I'm also joined by Jeremy Turner, who leads threat intelligence and security engineering for Coalition. And he's part of the team that's looking for security threats that would target our policyholders and other organizations. And really this team is looking for, we call needles in the haystack, looking for things that are threats that may target our policyholders and that we can then turn around and help with the forensics and the remediation process once we find those threats. So just a quick note on Zoom. You might see at the bottom of your screen two icons. One's a chat icon and the other is a Q&A. And we'd welcome you to submit your questions through those two, either of those two channels. And we'll be moderating questions throughout the conversation and then also leave some time at the end for open Q&A. Just a quick reminder about who we are. We're really excited to be joined by a broad group of policyholders and broker partners today. And Coalition is the fastest growing provider of cyber insurance and security in the US and now Canada. And you're all here because you have insurance policies with us. And so we're proud to partner with you and to insure you from these risks. One of the things that makes us different is that, not only do we offer a comprehensive insurance product, we also offer all of our policyholders proactive security tools and services to help manage and really try to prevent some of these cyber threats from occurring. And we'll be talking a little bit more about some of those measures towards the end of the conversation. So here's our agenda for today. We're going to start out by talking about ransomware claims by the numbers, sharing some of the trends that we've seen amongst our policyholders and the claims that they've reported over the last couple of years, and what that means for you in terms of sort of security and remediation. Then we're going to be talking about the OFAC advisory. So this is a new set of sort of guidance that was issued earlier this month about ransomware payments. We're going to be talking about what this means for our policyholders and the steps that we're taking to ensure that we're compliant. Then we're going to be talking about specific recommendations, security recommendations to try to prevent ransomware attacks from occurring. And as we'll talk about throughout this presentation, prevention is much easier than remediation. So we strongly advocate putting some of these measures in place in your organization. And then finally, open Q&A at the end. All right, so with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Jeremy.
Yeah, welcome all. Thank you for joining us today to talk about ransomware. This is, broadly at Coalition, we see, two primary claims themes. We see, ransomware, and we see fraudulent funds transfer. Out of the two, ransomware definitely, is usually the more difficult to deal with for organizations, as it's, kind of complex. But we'll kind of talk through, some of the concepts here and some of the things to think about when, trying to understand this risk. So, what is ransomware? Ransomware is basically just malware that infects, all your systems like any kind of malicious program would, but then it goes a step further and it decides it's going to go ahead and lock up all your files and prevent you from accessing anything. So, that's the kind of the real issue is, that these threat actors are looking for, systems that are critical to business processes, things that companies and organizations need to function properly, and they target those with this type of malware. Always with ransomware, there's always going to be a note, just like you'd see like in a movie, instead of this time, instead of being that kind of collage of, different magazine clippings, it's just going to be a plain old text file sitting on your desktop. Maybe some cagey note from the threat actor about how your system was insecure or something like that. But it's going to be, generally speaking, it's just going to be, kind of a short note that's going to say, we encrypted everything, pay us Bitcoin to get all your data back, and send it to this address. That's the general theme. There can be some variations on that. Sometimes the system will reboot, you'll get like a message and you can't even see anything. Sometimes you can see your desktop and there's just a text file on it that you have to open. But that's pretty much it. Once you get to that point, if you don't have backups, your data in most cases is pretty much irrecoverable. There are a few exceptions. And there are some instances where you can actually recover some of the data from a ransomware attack without having good backups, but those are pretty rare exceptions. The thing to consider here is this is a real threat. This is going to be more prevalent. We're only going to hear about this more and more. And if you don't know a business that's been affected by this yet, in the coming quarters, it's very likely that you will learn of another colleague or a business owner that has experienced some variation of this attack. With that said, that's a pretty, pretty dark scenario to encounter as a business trying to operate, especially now when our IT systems are even more critical to our business operations and everybody's remote. The way to address this risk is to, get an insurance policy. We're all here, we've already done that part, but then the next stage is also have a good backup solution. And backup solutions to protect against ransomware are a little bit different than your traditional backup systems. So we can talk about some examples of how that backup system to protect against ransomware would be different. And we can also talk more about the specifics of how to design systems and architectures, to kind of with this kind of threat in mind. Aside from an actual disaster where you have like a physical machine like goes down, hard drive failure or something like that. These are kind of nuanced, so we can talk more in depth about how to address those specific risks.
Sorry about that. Accidentally went
No worries.
forward too much. Let's go back a little bit.
I can talk fast, but maybe not that fast.
Sorry about that. 1 second.
There we go. Cool. Ransomware started years ago, and it was kind of an annoyance. Unfortunately, the threat actors that were doing that kind of stuff have gotten so much money. They've been able to kind of franchise their operations and, do things like buy Lamborghinis to do donuts in St. Petersburg Square. You can YouTube, hackers doing donuts and Lamborghinis, and you can see them literally doing just that. This concept of ransomware as a service, this is really what's kind of, pushing the proliferation of ransomware to a pretty insane level. The threat is probably the greatest threat when it comes to cybersecurity right now. You're much more likely to experience this type of incident than really any other type of incident, other than maybe like phishing, but which phishing is usually a precursor to ransomware, so they're kind of related sometimes. Some of these familiar models here, the familiar names in the ransomware game, Bitpaymer, Ryuk, Defray, Sudinokobe, or Revil. These are all some of the more common variants. If you're going to encounter one of these, ransomware, it's more statistically likely to be one of these. As you can see, the demand ranges have changed over time. And even the threat actors have taken their approach to figuring out how much they should demand. Some of them actually have like a formula. They'll try to look for your financials or get your organization size, and then kind of figure out like a formula on how much they should be demanding. Certainly, the more internet presence and the greater media footprint your organization has, the higher likelihood that demand is going to be over $1 million is. Go to the next slide. So, over time, we've seen this large increase in different types of ransomware attacks, and also the demand increase. As the threat actors have gotten paid, they think, oh, well, if the last one paid us $300,000, we probably should have asked for $350,000. Just like anybody would. If you're selling eggs at the market and somebody's willing to pay $2 for an egg, like, you should just charge everybody $2. If the next person pays $2.50, now everybody's getting charged $2.50. So we've seen that kind of increase in the marketplace, and also because the threat actors have gotten savvy to the fact that insurance coverage is part of the equation here. And so they know the kind of the industry average limits and what they might expect, or maybe even find in somebody's email box as they're rooting around through the network of what some kind of coverage limits or policy limits they can go after. So this is kind of driving an increase in the severity of ransomware claims. Some of the targets that the threat groups have also chosen have kind of driven this higher. It's not uncommon to hear or see in the news that a hospital or some other kind of critical institution has been kind of crippled by ransomware. So those demands have certainly surged, and we expect that trend to continue going forward. So here's a kind of a distribution of what we see with the average demand on the different ransomware strains. Maze, you see at the top of the list there. The Maze demands are kind of the highest because one of the things that this group Maze, that distributes Maze, has kind of done is it was one of the first groups to start exfiltrating or stealing data with, as part of their process. So when they get in the network, before they encrypt everything, they go ahead and try to steal all your email, all your files. And what they're going to do is they're going to say, if you don't pay us, hey, we're going to just post all your company's data online, so all your competitors and customers can see that their own data is there. And they use that threat as leverage to increase the demand. There are a lot of other malware strains that also exfiltrate data or steal data from networks. But Maze was really kind of the first one to start doing this. And while others have kind of followed suit, Maze by volume per incident seems to be high. So they do fewer incidents, but higher amounts of data stolen. And then you have other variants like Ragnar and Medusa, which are more widely distributed and still exfiltrate a lot of data. But a lot of that is kind of automated process of kind of harvesting the data. So that's kind of an overview of what you can expect from different ransomware and kind of what's driving, the necessity to kind of consider this type of risk. So we go to there we go. So I'll turn it over to Rich Katz to continue the conversation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. I'm going to be talking about the October 2020 OFAC advisory, which, as if you've seen it on LinkedIn or other places, it's kind of caused a little bit of a ruckus within the cyber insurance industry and the cybersecurity industry in general. I think generally it is a reflection upon the issues our world is facing with cybersecurity, with ransomware, business email compromises, funds transfer frauds, and with the federal government taking a stronger look at this to see, what can they do to help kind of stop the bleeding. The one thing I want to lead with, though, and that I want everyone to remember throughout the entirety of this presentation, is that nothing has changed. The OFAC advisory does not have the power to change law. It is not a notification of any changes in the law. It is just a reminder of the law as it exists right now. So it's a little bit perfunctory in that, nothing's changed, right? And we haven't changed our processes or procedures in how we deal with ransomware. We still write ransomware insurance. We still pay ransomware claims when reasonable and necessary. The processes and procedures we had in place prior to the advisory are still in place, and that all exist to ensure that our policyholders are protected. Next slide, please. So the advisory came out, I believe, on October 1st. And as I said, it really just renews the understanding of the sanctions that are available to OFAC if you are to pay a ransom to an individual or entity on the OFAC list. The OFAC list is primarily concerned with making sure that money does not go to enemies of the state or criminals who are working against the United States, et cetera, state actors such as North Korea or Iran. And so, the list is nothing more than a list, and it contains names, addresses, entity names, and with the advent of ransomware, it also contains Bitcoin addresses and potentially other cryptocurrency addresses as well. And so the whole rationale behind it is you cannot make a payment to these bad actors. And even if you did not know that they were a bad actor, and the OFAC list specifically requires that even if the individual or entity you make a payment to, if they're not on the list, but they are owned by a 50% more or more majority by an individual or entity on the OFAC list, then they are subsumed within that OFAC list. So fines and penalties can arise from a payment to that entity or individual. And the legal liability with payment to an entity or individual on OFAC is what's called strict liability. And what that means is that even if you didn't know that entity was on the OFAC list and you made a payment, you could still be liable for fines and penalties. So again, the advisory, I encourage everyone to read it. It is fairly strongly worded, but it does not, again, really change anything. And this is, again, primarily focused on the incredibly large amount of increase in ransomware attacks we're facing. I was speaking with the FBI the other day, and they said that we just crossed the $1 billion paid to threat actors on ransomware. This is a big business. There's also been some data breach security reports that have come out that are alleging that the actual data breaches where data has been stolen is down quite a bit in the tens of percentages. And my conjecture is that's because ransomware is so profitable. So instead of bad actors wanting to break into a system to steal data and then try to sell that, they're breaking into a system to get that access and then selling it to a ransomware as a service provider or another bad actor to actually deploy a banking Trojan and then deploy ransomware. So the big issue here is to make sure that one, we understand what OFAC is. We understand what the obligations that an American citizen has to comply with OFAC, and then also understand that the government's taking a more thorough look at ransomware generally. Next slide, please. So again, what does this mean for the policyholders of Coalition and the industry at large? Nothing's changed again, and I don't want to be too redundant, but there really has been no changes, and specifically, there's been no changes to our claims process. We maintain rigorous compliance processes and procedures when completing ransomware payments. The entities and vendors that we use, they are money transmitters under FinCEN. They file suspicious activity reports via FinCEN, as well as going through multiple OFAC checks to ensure that any ransom payment that's being made is not being paid to an entity or individual on the OFAC list. Now, one of the things that we do and that we will be encouraging our policyholders to do is to partner with law enforcement in dealing with ransomware events. We do have some contacts at the FBI, and we have a process by which we share ransomware information, technical and otherwise, with the FBI. But the advisory specifically said, if by cooperating with law enforcement, by notifying law enforcement of the ransomware event, that will act as a heavy mitigation of any potential fines and penalties. Now, unfortunately, we don't really know what that mitigation means. We don't know, is it a 20% mitigation? Is it 100%? Do you just get a slap on the wrist? So because of that, we're definitely advising all of our insureds that go through a ransomware event to file an ic3.gov report with the FBI, allow Coalition to send information to the FBI regarding that specific ransomware variant that the policyholder is dealing with, as well as to cooperate with the FBI should they have any additional questions. Now, something to note, OFAC is driven by the Department of Treasury, and in our discussions with the FBI, there's been a little bit of a, I don't want to say friction, but a little bit of a difference in how the FBI deals with ransomware and how the Department of Treasury deals with ransomware. The FBI has told me that they're in the law enforcement business. So they are not going to really send information to Treasury in regards to any ransom payment made. Okay, so they want information, technical or otherwise, that they can use to indict these bad actors and potentially put them in jail and stop their operations. The Department of Treasury, on the other hand, is a little bit more, I guess, strong arming in saying, hey, you guys can't make payments under any rational basis, right? Well, there is a process by which you can get a license with the Department of Treasury to make a payment to someone on the OFAC list. And that's something that we have vendors and third parties that are able to move forward with that process. So, something to keep in mind is, and I see a question just popped up, why would a company not want to involve the FBI in a ransomware claim? And there's multiple reasons for that. The company may think that the FBI is going to publish it, that they're going to involve, other regulators or whatnot in the discussion, that they might try to take over the remediation of the ransomware event or other actions that might, implicate or ruin the business processes of the company. So it's something where we do have that discussion with insureds, and some insureds choose not to involve the FBI. But now we have an explicit reason for them to do so, in that it definitely creates a framework by which, if there is any OFAC violation, that there could be some substantial mitigation for that. Next slide, please. So I just want to talk more generally about what our cyber policy covers, so that you guys have the information necessary to understand how your policy would respond with a ransomware event. So there's 3 or actually 4 parts of the policy that are typically implicated in a ransomware event. The first is our cyber extortion policy, which is specifically focused on dealing with ransomware. So that provides for any reasonable and necessary costs to respond to an extortion incident, and includes the payment of a ransom demand. The decision to ultimately make a payment for a ransom demand is our insured's. That's not something we can force you to do or not force you to do. Typically, when we're adjudicating a claim or making recommendations to our policyholders, it's really a cost-benefit analysis. Is it better to, how much is it going to cost to remediate the system, restore the network? Are there functional backups? And so oftentimes it will take longer to decrypt after payment of a ransom than it would to restore the system from backups, because you still have to clean that system, create a new sandbox to play in, and then reinstall the entire network apparatus. Another part of the policy that responds is our breach response costs. And so this typically is what you'd find when there's been access to or exfiltration of personally identifiable information or private health information or third-party corporate information. And so this includes, hiring a forensic expert to determine the method of intrusion, also whether or not there's been access to that personally identifiable information, public relations experts, as well as notification to any individuals that may have had their personal information compromised, and in order to comply with any privacy regulatory statutes or procedures. And one of the cool things about our policy as well is that it does provide for voluntary notification and credit monitoring, even if there has not been a access to specific personally identifiable information, but as a public relations gesture to maintain the goodwill of the company. And we also have business interruptions and extra expense coverage. Often with a ransomware event, the entire network or a part of the network has been taken down as non-functional, and this will impact the commercial operations of the business. And so the business interruption coverage will pay for any net decrease in profits that the business has incurred due to the ransomware event. An extra expense is a coverage that we allow in order to reduce the potential business interruption loss. And essentially that's any expenses that you need to incur in order to keep your business functioning. I had a ransomware claim the other day where they needed 20 laptops to send to their different stores in order to keep the business up and running and keep servicing customers. So we authorized it. They went out to Best Buy, and within a couple hours, they had the laptops needed to keep their business up and running. And so that's an example of an extra expense. Next slide, please. And then for recommendations to prevent ransomware, If you can move to the next one, thank you. So these three are like the most important things that you could do just generally for cybersecurity and specifically as it impacts ransomware. These bad actors are professionals and they have a almost corporate structure in how they deal with things. And they're actively looking for, access to any companies that they can get a hold of. And they will go in there and they will review your financial records. There's been incidents where they forwarded our negotiators cyber insurance policies, and said, hey, we know how much cyber insurance coverage you have. Like, we want that amount, right? So it's really nefarious. They will take the time to try to extort you as much as they possibly can. So in order to keep that from happening, these three things are really, really, really important. The first one being multi-factor authentication. So you typically see this in regards to email, right? If you have a Gmail or Outlook email address, if you have to get a text message or you open up Authy or another third-party application to get, a key to log in, that's really helpful because even if your login, even if your username and password gets compromised, or if you fall, if you fall victim to a phishing email and they steal your credentials that way, if you have 2FA involved, the chances of them getting access to that account are virtually nil. I've been doing cyber claims for a long time, and I've only had one instance where an entity with 2FA ever had that account accessed, and that was because the individual actually got a phone call from someone, the bad actor, purporting to be their IT department and said, hey, we're having issues with your account. Can you please give us the code that was just sent to your phone? And that's definitely beyond the pale and more social engineering, but that just kind of also describes how nefarious these individuals are. And then multi-factor authentication is also something that you should put on any cloud-based services or any applications or platform as a service. Anything that you're logging into with username and password, there should be multi-factor authentication setting for it, and that should be turned on. And also remove remote access or RDP. We found that misconfigured remote access is responsible for 29% of our claims. And this is even more of an issue with our post-COVID environment, with entities moving towards work from home and not necessarily having the infrastructure to have all their employees work from home. So they've had to kind of jury rig, network access, and often what they'll do is they'll leave ports or other connections open to the public in order to maintain that access, right? And so you really want to make sure that if you are doing that, if it is business critical to do that, right, that number one, you're only doing it for business critical functions and only for individuals and IP addresses who require the access. And in a perfect world, that access should be behind a virtual private network that will limit your exposure. And going back to the 2FA or multi-factor authentication, that VPN should have 2FA installed on it. And then also, and probably even most importantly, establish routine backups. Over the past 3 weeks, I've had, I think, 5 or 6 ransomware claims that have come in. And we've only had to pay the ransom on 2 of them. And the only reason we paid the ransom was because they did not have effective backups. Okay, so this is really, really, really important that if you have business critical information, that if you're thinking about it, if that information was encrypted, you could not access to it. You could not function with your business. You could not, get credit or move forward with financial, activities. Then that's something that you really need to back up. And you want to make sure that you store the backups in an offsite location. And that doesn't mean, physically offsite, but something that's not connected to your main business network or air gapped. And then also that you have a routine. One of the insureds that I dealt with that did not have to pay the ransom, they had a monthly backup, a weekly backup, and a daily backup. Okay. And they were all compartmentalized and they were all separated. And part of their backups were even on physical tape, right? So it wasn't just like cloud storage backups or whatnot. So and we didn't have to pay the ransom. It's very, very important that we do this and think about this, because it only takes a second for an entire world to change with a ransomware event. One of the things our IR professionals say is there's the 1-10-60 rule, right? Like, you need to detect an intrusion within 1 minute, investigate it within 10 minutes, and stop it within 60 minutes. Otherwise, it's likely your system's going to be compromised and ransomware is going to be deployed. So you really only have, seconds to deal with this. But if you have a good backup routine, then you have that fail safe in case everything goes bad.
Great. So we've gotten a couple questions submitted so far, and I'll kind of moderate and would love other questions as they occur to you. But first, I wanted to ask a question directed to Jeremy, kind of building on some of the recommendations that we were just making around remote access. What are some of the ways in which policyholders can safely and securely access their files remotely in this sort of remote working environment? We've had a lot of policyholders ask this question around how to securely transition now that we're all accessing everything from home.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the best ways to safely access those remote sources is over a VPN. Often there's a lot of different technologies that are employed for cybersecurity protection at office locations, like things like firewalls and some web filtering and all that kind of good stuff. And by moving remote, we kind of often lose some of those capabilities that have been invested in from many corporations. And a VPN is pretty much the always the first answer on that list. Is we'd always like to see that be the case, a well-configured VPN. Realizing that that's probably not feasible for every case. There's a number of other remote access solutions. And interestingly enough, I never thought I would be recommending people to use things like LogMeIn or TeamViewer or some of these client-based remote access solutions. But to be honest, those are actually much more difficult to target from a threat actor perspective. And we see those technologies being safer than some of the other alternatives that we see in the marketplace. The most risky remote access service right now is RDP. So if you're using Windows Remote Desktop Protocol, that is the #1 targeted technology on the internet right now by a long shot. Just looking at the scan data, the number of scans that go on every week, we see about half a billion events of different checks for RDP, compared to the next most common, which is Windows file sharing, which by comparison is pretty low, which only had about 500,000. So when we look at the difference between half a billion and 500,000 events, it's just staggering, the amount of different threat actors targeting RDP. A lot of this had to do with this bad vulnerability called Bluekeep, where threat actors kind of spun up a ton of infrastructure to find and exploit these these RDP exposures. But even after everybody's kind of patched that vulnerability and even implemented things like multi-factor authentication, the threat actors have still persisted on RDP as a way that they target organizations, because what they're using that to do now is to identify companies that actually have that soft kind of squishy exposure inside their network. And they also know that people are exposing RDP to the internet because there's some kind of business process or critical business function that remote workers need to have access to in order to continue to work. So it's kind of one of those things where, like, when they find it, they know that, oh, look, this company has infrastructure internally on their network, and they also are using this for a business process, which means they're a prime target for us. So aside from just the vulnerability and exposure for RDP, they're also targeting it as just kind of what we call like a coordinating indicator, or like a specific condition they're looking for that makes them just sit at their keyboard and like try harder. So we always like to see RDP closed, and we often require that. One of the other ones that we see quite often is RDWeb, which is another Windows remote desktop program. This is also a targeted technology. It's not as severely targeted as Windows Remote Desktop, but it's another prime target. For organizations that are considering a long-term solution for remote access, we'd encourage everybody to take a look at an open source program called Apache Guacamole. And the Guacamole is kind of made up of a bunch of different components, but essentially it provides a secure gateway to access different remote access services without actually exposing them to the internet. So this would give you access to things like Windows RDP, SSH, and lots of other different services that you can use to remotely access resources, but it does it in a way that's not exposing any of those technologies to the internet. It's kind of acting as a middleman to kind of facilitate those different solutions.
Thank you. Got another question that Rich, I'd love to hear your perspective on, which is what actually happens with policyholders during a claim? So, from first discovering that their files are locked down through working with law enforcement, working with IR, what are kind of the stages of that claims process, and how do we get involved throughout that?
Sure. And so the first thing that we need to do is be made aware of the ransomware event. In the past 2 or 3 weeks, ransomware has been hitting everyone hard, but I had 2 specific insureds who had indications of ransomware and did not notify us for, in one instance, it was around 7 days. In another instance, it was around 15. In both those instances, they were able to remediate the initial infection, and then they had more mission critical files encrypted thereafter. And if we would have been properly notified, we would have been able to stop that further infection and further encryption. So the first thing that we can do to help is by getting notice of the matter, and whether that's through our claims hotline or our claims email address. It's really important that we get that. So we're the ones, the claims teams are the ones that are answering those emails, answering that hotline. I always say that, speed kills, and with cyber events, specifically ransomware, the quicker we can get on station, the better it is for, getting it resolved. And so we do an initial call with the insured, try to get as much information as we can, technical or otherwise. Specifically, what type of variant, do we have a copy of the ransom note, how many endpoints, servers are impacted, so that then we can then triage that and get legal counsel and forensics in place. So we, after the initial scoping call, sometimes in certain situations, I'll have counsel and forensics on the initial scoping call with me to make sure that all the information is relayed as quickly as possible. And then at that point, and because we want legal counsel involved at the beginning, because any work that a forensic firm does is under the auspices of that legal counsel in conjunction with the insured to maintain attorney-client privilege. So if there's ever a lawsuit arising from the ransomware event, the investigative work and analysis done by the forensic firm is protected. And so, once we get counsel and forensics in place, the claims team, is still very much involved, but we do kind of take a back seat. It's more akin to, kind of being a football coach on game day, right? Like you can get all the players in position and you can kind of direct them as far as what plays you should do. But once the game actually starts, the coach can't play. And so we're really focused on, getting our insureds with our panel vendors who have a ton of experience, unfortunately, with ransomware events. Our forensic vendors that we use specifically for ransomware events are ones that are money transmitter licensed with FinCEN, and also perform, in-depth OFAC checks and otherwise to make sure that any payments made are perfectly legal. And so throughout that process, the goal is, number one, to ensure that the business is up and running as quickly as possible. 2, to mollify any potential or mitigate any potential damages that might occur on an ongoing basis. And there's many parts of the policy that respond that I discussed earlier. And so, our goal is to make sure, what does the business need to keep running? Is it reasonable and necessary to pay the ransom? Are there backups in place? And have a discussion with the insured in regards to what's the best, cost benefit scenario. Because we do have the benefit of being kind of an objective third party. And so sometimes we can look at things and say, okay, well, it's going to cost $400,000 to repair your network versus paying, $100,000 for a ransom. And then having that discussion with the stakeholders at the insured. And then once the ransom paid or once, the network's been remediated, making sure that we're evaluating any business interruption loss to make sure that the insured's going to be made whole as a result of this. And then, just really ensuring that our insured and policyholder understand what's going on, understand what the policy provides, and, giving them as much coverage as we reasonably can.
Great, thank you. Another question, I think this is a really thoughtful question. And Jeremy, I'd love to hear your take on this. What are some of the broader and longer term implications of a ransomware attack, even if you don't have to pay because you have solid backups?
Yeah, it's a great question. The first consideration is what data could be exposed. So, there's the question of, if data is stolen, if the threat actors do take data, what's going to be the fallout from that? very often we see threat actors say that, oh, if you pay us to delete it, we'll delete it. We can tell you that's not the case, and they're not actually deleting anything. So it's not really worthwhile there. So in that case, it kind of just turns into a regular, breach exposure mitigation. But also, even after you pay the ransom, there's also the issue of latent compromise to consider. So when we're doing remediation, it's important to consider what's it going to take to make sure that the threat actor, or maybe even threat actor that facilitated access to the environment to conduct the ransomware activity, has been removed from the environment. One of the things that we're tracking is there's a group that is a very sophisticated group, and this group called Evil Corp often has maintained access to companies going back several years. And there's this kind of repeat pattern of every year to a year and a half, there's a ransomware event. And what's happening there is this group of threat actors called Evil Corp has turned their access to these networks into kind of a ransomware annuity, where every so often, about every year to a year and a half, they resell or market access to this company as a ransomware target. So usually what they'll do is they'll steal a bunch of email, they'll steal the financials, they'll create like a target package saying, here's the financial statements, here's a whole bunch of emails, here's how much you should charge for the ransom, and here's how much you're going to have to pay us upfront for access to this target. So those are some of the things that can happen, or to consider, like after, if you've experienced a ransomware incident, or anybody that has. Those are things to consider. It's number one is what kind of obligations for notification or protecting any potential information exposure would be required, and then number two, how to make sure that when the remediation activity is conducted, or you've recovered operations, how to make sure or have reassurance that the threat actor is not still in your network. And those are kind of key objectives of bringing in an incident response firm as well.
I'll jump in there too. And I think more generally, when we go through the ransomware process or event, if you do not pay the ransom, that does not mean that we don't do a thorough evaluation and examination of the network to make sure that the infection or intrusion is gone. So, really the only thing that changes is whether or not a ransom payment is made or not. And typically there's, as Jeremy was describing, we definitely don't want to get reinfected. So the policy does provide coverage to ensure that the security failure or data breach is fully remediated. So in my experience, I have not seen, in claims that we've handled, any type of re-extortion on an insured that did not pay the ransom, because we have the proper vendors and stakeholders in place to ensure that doesn't happen. This is also why it's very important that, when you're working on a ransomware event, that you do notify your cyber carrier and have an actual incident response forensic firm working on it. IT consultants are great, and some of them are very knowledgeable, but if they're just, if they're not working on this every day and have a reputation in the marketplace on working on it, then that's where things sometimes get missed. And, I definitely have heard or have seen our current policyholders that had prior events when they were not policyholders with us, that they basically had a ransomware variant stuck on their systems for years because it was not properly remediated in the first place. So, I think, again, to summarize, not paying doesn't really indicate any future issues as long as you fully remediate the system and ensure that the infection's gone. And I can actually follow up on your follow-up question, Jeffrey. So it really depends. Our friend, and for everyone, he asked a question on, is there a presumption that the data is exposed regardless of payment? And are notifications made to individuals via potential data breach or other steps to mitigate data breach liability must be taken? So it really depends on if there's been access to the data, right? Because if there has been access to the data, then typically you have to assume that there's been some exfiltration. And it also depends on what type of data it is. The definition of personally identifiable information varies via privacy statute by state, but generally it's social security number, driver's license number, financial login information, private health information, or banking information or something along those lines. Most often, the type of data that's accessed does not fall underneath that umbrella. Now, if it does, then that would mandate notification, even in the absence of confirmation of exfiltration. But generally, we would look at it as, one, did they have access to the data? Was the deployment of ransomware something that was just, kind of a package deployment where they just someone opened up an executable file, it started encrypting, and that was it? Or was it something more nefarious where they had deployed a banking Trojan, or there's a business email compromise with lateral movement within the network that, where they sit there and camped for a while, reviewed things. We saw a lot of information being taken off the network because our forensic firms can look and say, okay, was there a lot of information taken off, whether in large dumps or many small dumps, and so if they don't see that, then we can say, okay, they just deployed this ransomware, they didn't have access to any of the data, and there would not be any notification responsibilities. But if we do see that, then we need to make sure, okay, does the data that was accessed, does that implicate any privacy statute or regulations or obligations for notification? And again, I mentioned this before too, our policy also provides for voluntary notifications. So even if there's not been personally identifiable information, but there has been data of a client or customer of yours, and out of an abundance of caution or as a public relations gesture, we think it's reasonable and necessary to notify them and provide credit monitoring, that's something that would be fully covered under the policy.
Great, thank you. And one last question, and Jeremy, would love for you to respond to this one before we wrap. People are asking, how do they actually go about setting up some of those security protocols that we recommended, specifically VPN, but how do you recommend that people go about setting up a VPN for their organization?
Yeah, sure. One of the simplest ways to do this is to kind of look and see what type of firewall you might have on your business network. Very often, a VPN functionality is actually included in a lot of these, business class firewalls. So, the first step there would be kind of look and see what kind of hardware you have on your network. And that might be as simple as contacting your IT provider and asking them to set up your folks working remote with VPN access. And we're happy to on the security team, we're happy to field all those different questions because it can be so different, and there's so many different potential configurations out there from a network perspective. We're happy to take those on a case-by-case basis, or email or in a meeting or whatever the case may be. But generally speaking, most of the small business firewalls and enterprise firewalls you're going to encounter out there will have this functionality kind of bundled in there. So it might be something you actually already even have in many cases.
Thank you. And as a follow-up to this webinar, we also typically send out some related security resources, and we can send some more information about VPN configuration as part of that as well. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and thank everybody so much for joining us this morning to learn more about some of the trends that we're seeing in ransomware and the OFAC advisory specifically. And I hope that this provided you with some helpful recommendations that you can take back to your organization. I just want to reiterate again that this doesn't change anything in terms of our approach or process around handling ransomware. Our recommendations around preventative measures and remediation, and then the actual payment of a ransomware claim remain the same. But if you have any questions or want to sort of talk about anything more specific to your organization, as Jeremy just mentioned, we'd be more than happy to spend some time with you or some of the technical folks on your team to address those issues specifically. So thank you for spending some time with us, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.